When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
It's Wednesday, Adams. I see you're trying to distract yourself from your own banal thoughts. Let me help. Here's a recording thing made of my latest root canal.
Wednesday Season 2 is now playing, only on Netflix.
Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcasts, and Killer Podcast presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
All right, breaking news coming in from the state of Idaho once again, but on a different story, as News Nation has just learned that the accused killer, Brian Koberger, accepted a plea deal. Yeah, a plea deal was offered, and he has accepted the deal. Sources are confirming that prosecutors proposed dropping the death penalty. That was the deal in exchange for Koberger pleading guilty to committing 4 murders and pleading guilty to burglary as well. So guilty plea in exchange for no death penalty. Now the background on this story, you'll remember he's accused of killing those 4 University of Idaho students at their home. It was back in November of 2022. Sources say Koberger must also agree to spend the rest of his life in prison without any possibility of parole. So jail for life, no parole.
And then let me ask you, did you, on November 13th, 2022, enter the residence at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, with the intent to commit the felony crime of murder?
Yes.
Did you, on November 13th, 2022, in Latah County, state of Idaho, kill and murder Madison Mogan, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice of forethought?
Yes.
Did you, on or about that same date in Moscow, Idaho, kill and murder Kaylee Gonzalez, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice of forethought?
Yes.
And did you, on that same date in Moscow, Idaho, kill and murder Xana Kernodle, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, with premeditation and malice of forethought?
Yes.
And then on or about November 13th, 2022, again in Latah County, Idaho, did you kill and murder Ethan Chapin, a human being?
Yes.
Did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, with premeditation and malice of forethought?
Yes.
Hello and welcome to Who Killed. I'm your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media and Evergreen Podcast production. Welcome back. I've been on a summer hiatus to catch up on some traveling, and I spent some time with my family, and I'm also working on a new project, with the release date to be announced in due time. Now that school is back in session and summer is coming to an end, I realized it was time to dust off the keyboard, uncover the microphone, and return to what I do best. And that's each week where I strive to raise awareness about cases that may not have received the same media attention as high-profile crimes. I like to say that we're a voice for the voiceless, and that will continue to be our focus. However, we are adjusting a few things, like our release schedule, to Wednesdays. The reason for this change is that we will be introducing a new segment called Cold Case America, which will air on Fridays. With Who Killed premiering on Wednesdays and Cold Case America following on Fridays, you can expect more content and a wider variety of guests, including investigators, family members, local news reporters, and others involved with the cases. While I work on Cold Case America, I may periodically bring in a special guest or two to host Who Killed. You'll hear some familiar voices when I'm out of the office attending to other business. With all that being said, we have a lot to look forward to as we return from summer break. Speaking of summer, I missed a lot in the world of true crime. Since I was last on the air in May, there have been some significant headlines, and here are a few that stood out. I'm not going to go too deep. In a disturbing, politically motivated attack, 4 Minnesota legislators were shot. This was a targeted spree shooting in Minnesota that left State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark dead. Now, shortly before this incident, Senator John Huffman and his family were injured in a separate nearby attack. Vance Luther Bolter, who was swiftly identified and captured, has been indicted on multiple murder charges, including attempted murder. Locally for me, there was a terror attack in Boulder where a man carried out an anti-Semitic-inspired firebombing on Pearl Street, and this was in Boulder, Colorado. The suspect now faces 118 state charges and federal hate crime charges. In June, the FBI continued its search for Travis Decker, who is wanted for the murder of his 3 daughters in Washington state. The family's bodies were discovered with evidence of asphyxiation, and a $20,000 reward is active. He is accused of killing his 3 young daughters, Peyton, Evelyn, and Olivia. Unfortunately, the bodies were found near his abandoned vehicle at Rock Island Campground in Chelan County, Washington on June 2nd, 2025. As I said, the search continues. The Karen Reed trial began in April when I was still on the air, and it was resolved in mid-June. After a month of testimony, the jury actually acquitted Reed of all major charges, including second-degree murder, manslaughter while under the influence, and leaving the scene of an accident. Obviously, this case is a lot of media attention, and it will continue to remain in the zeitgeist as long as TV shows, movies, and books continue to be written about the case. Shocking most people was when one Mr. P. Diddy was acquitted on charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking. Now, Diddy was convicted on 2 counts of transportation for prostitution and will probably do some jail time. Judging by the response on social media, this was surprising to most people, including myself. Another story that actually just wrapped up over this past week was the denial of parole for the Menendez brothers, who are in prison for murdering their parents. And in probably the biggest case of the summer, there was a significant development in the 2022 University of Idaho student murders. Suspect Brian Koberger pleaded guilty on July 2nd, 2025, to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. This will kick off the 4th quarter of the 2025 podcast season. This week, I am honored to have defense attorney and legal expert for Court TV and News Nation, Matt Mangino, joining us. He will provide a breakdown of the biggest case of the past few years, the Idaho 4. And I really don't enjoy doing shows that focus on the perpetrator, but this particular week, I felt we needed to explain the plea deal. However, it's important to remember that our main focus will always be on the lives of Madison Mogan, Kaylee Gonclaves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, Xana's boyfriend, and how their lives were tragically cut short. With all this being said, let's jump into our conversation with attorney Matt Mangino. Hello and welcome back to Who Killed? I am your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media and Evergreen podcast production. I have been off since the end of May, and there's been a lot of stuff that has transpired, but one of the biggest stories that has happened in the past few years is the Brian Koberger Idaho 4 case, and we finally have some resolution, and of course, I had to have on my resident expert in law, and that is one Matt Mangino. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill. It's always a pleasure.
So, Matt, people may remember you from previous visits, but can you explain a little bit about what you do?
Well, I'm a practicing criminal defense attorney. I spent a couple terms in Western Pennsylvania in a county, Lawrence County, as the district attorney. And after I left the DA's office, the governor at the time, Ed Rendell, appointed me to the parole board. So I spent a 6-year term on the parole board as well. And I continue to practice criminal law now as I did before I was a prosecutor. And I've also had an opportunity to dabble in a couple things. I like to write. I've written a book on the death penalty, The Executioner's Toll, 2010, which was published by McFarland and Company. I get to write a weekly column, which I really enjoy, for Creators Syndicate. Crime and Conduct is the name of the column. So I do some things that I really like that are related to the work that I do. So it's a lot of fun.
Well, that's awesome. And you obviously make television talking head appearances on Court TV and News Nation.
Right. Yeah, those are fun to do, to talk about, again, cases like the Koberger case and other cases that are in the news and other issues with regard to, constitutional authority, especially around this time now, and issues with regard to the United States Supreme Court. So it's all fun.
Yeah, it's great that you get to do and dabble in all the different things that you enjoy, and it's always a pleasure for me to have you on and kind of explain some of the things that I don't necessarily understand, and probably a lot of the audience doesn't understand, as far as certain aspects of pleas. And as we know, Koberger took a plea, and in this plea, he didn't have to, how would you explain it? He didn't have to explain how he did it or why he did it. And what are your feelings on if that's normal, or is this something that you've seen before? What happened?
Yeah, well, it is an interesting situation with regard to the Koberger case because, as you know, and as your listeners know, this case created an unbelievable amount of media attention. Everybody was following this case. If you remember when this case, first came about, when Koberger was arrested, his lawyers were demanding that the case move forward as quickly as possible. They wanted to preserve their speedy trial rights and all that sort of thing. So this thing was moving, and there were hearings, and of course there were rumors and leaks and all kind of stuff, and everybody was on top of this because of the tragic aspect of it. 4 young college students, murdered in their apartment, and then the case is scheduled for trial after all these pretrial motions and different things filed, and then right on the eve of trial, you find out that Brian Koberger is going to plead guilty to these offenses. It's kind of like, when you think about it, it's like, this is like the run up to the Super Bowl, and everybody's waiting, sitting on the edge of their seats, and one of the teams doesn't show up. It was a shock that reverberated, throughout the criminal justice system, throughout the country, even around the world. People were following this case. So the plea was kind of surprising. It came at a point when everybody anticipated that this was going to be a full-blown trial, and we were going to hear everything about this case that so many people were following. So the surprise factor was huge. And then, when you look at what ultimately happened, he enters a plea. Obviously, there's an elocution during his plea where he has to admit to committing, certain crimes, and he did all that. But when it came time to sentencing, and they asked him if he had anything to say, he says, "No, thank you, I don't." And we don't hear anything else. So one of the big things that people are talking about is the why factor. Why did he do this? Okay, now we know that he did it, and he know that he essentially slaughtered these 4, college students. We don't know why, and we will probably never know why. And I think that has rubbed some people the wrong way.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like it kind of blindsided everybody, especially the families. You feel for them. It was kind of split. Some were happy with the plea until, I don't know if they were happy with it until they found out he didn't have to explain it. Or they were just happy about the fact that they got to close that chapter of this horrible tragedy. And again, we've been following this since the beginning, and these girls and this gentleman were absolutely just they were butchered, unfortunately, in a very cowardice way. He stalked them, and then we don't ever get to be, the word satisfied isn't necessarily applicable, but it's somewhat applicable. And so I'll say we didn't get the details that we all were looking for on motive, the stalking, what he had done previously, if he had stalked other people even. Were there other cases that just were test, or he was just, because all these things escalate. You don't just wake up one day and decide I'm going to go and murder 4 people. I mean,
yeah. And I think, one of the things that I think people were uncomfortable with is, let's say these horrible crimes happened, in Wisconsin. Well, they don't have a death penalty in Wisconsin. They haven't had a death penalty in Wisconsin since 1852. Okay. So he got 4 consecutive life sentences plus 10 years. So that's the maximum that he could have gotten in a state like Wisconsin. Okay. So nobody could ask for more. So it doesn't matter what he says or what he does. There's no leverage. It can't give you anything else but that. But in Idaho, it's a little bit different. Okay. Idaho has a death penalty. And not only that, in recent months, Idaho has made the firing squad their default method of the death penalty. So it's not as though that people there are in favor of the death penalty. So that could have been used as leverage in this case, and it has been used as leverage in other high-profile cases. So for instance, with the Green River Killer in the state of Washington, who's responsible for 48 murders. he got life in prison, all right, without the possibility of parole. The reason he did is because they were using the death penalty to say, listen, if you tell us where your victims are, where did you leave their bodies? If you help us with some closure for these families, we won't seek the death penalty. We'll seek life in prison. But in Idaho, they could have said, listen, you tell us why you did this. You tell us what the motive is. You tell us how you went about stalking and planning and why you did that, and we'll take the death penalty off the table. But if you don't, we're gonna keep the death penalty on the table. We're gonna go to trial, and we're gonna execute you by firing squad. I think that's what some people are uncomfortable with. There could have been more from this than 4 consecutive life in prison without parole in 10 years. There could have been some explanation, and there is precedent for that kind of explanation. The only thing that you can figure in this case, and I'm not. There may be a lot more about this than I know, and we know that some of the victims' families, weren't happy necessarily with the outcome. So why wouldn't you try to provide some additional closure for families if that opportunity existed? And I think that's what has some people uncomfortable with this plea and ultimate sentence.
Yeah, and we've talked about the death penalty a bunch, but obviously with your book and then with this case. And before we talked about it, you had mentioned, how many years it had been since they had actually used the death penalty, and you used Pennsylvania as an example. Mm-hmm. It's still in the books, but it hasn't been used in years. Mm-hmm. Did they not use the death penalty long enough? I mean, didn't they originally put that on the table? And am I forgetting something? But I thought they put that on the table at first.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was, talk about, the death penalty, obviously if this case went to trial. And so, what the state gave up was seeking the death penalty in exchange for these pleas. And so, what you can glean from that is one thing. Well, hey, we saved ourselves a trial. We didn't have to go through a trial. We didn't have to put the victims' families, the other witnesses. We didn't have to do all that. But is not going to trial worth this plea if you're not going to gain anything more than the fact that, yes, I committed these murders, and that's all I'm going to tell you. I think, in my opinion, that the leverage could have gone to a greater distance and provided some additional closure for families and for all people who were alarmed and horrified by this crime.
Yeah, and you think about the people in Moscow, Idaho, where the campus is, and all the people that were there and had to experience the trauma of what occurred that night. And do you find it, I know you don't want to play Monday morning quarterback, mm-hmm. but do you feel like they just kind of dropped the ball on the death penalty and what they could have used it for? I mean, it seems to me, hey, you're firing squad, unless you tell us what happened. I mean, how do you do a plea without getting them to have to tell the court what they did?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, what we want to be sure that we acknowledge is that he had to, and he did admit to the killings. Okay,
Sure.
so that he took that responsibility. What was sort of left undone was the issue of why would you kill 4 college students who you don't know? What was your motivation? What was your motive in doing this? Was it just for the thrill of seeing if you could get away with murder? I mean, I think that's something that families and others would want to know. But as I said a moment ago, there's a lot of factors that go into this case, and I would say at the outset that I thought investigators and prosecutors did an outstanding job of finding Brian Koberger. We have you have some DNA that's on a sheath, but you don't have any place for that DNA to match. And so you begin to build this case by surveillance, by cell phone pings, by going and grabbing the garbage at his parents' home in eastern Pennsylvania to see if you can make some sort of DNA match. So I think that work was outstanding, and I don't question the decisions that prosecutors made in this case. I just think that a lot of people who've observed this case, and even some of the victims' families, weren't entirely satisfied with the end result of life in prison without the possibility of parole, consecutively, one after another. So there's no way this guy's ever getting out of prison. And, his rights to appeal are very limited because he entered a guilty plea. So for all intents and purposes, you got as good as the death penalty. This guy's not going to walk among the public for the rest of his life. But did you get all the questions answered that you wanted? And I think that's what some people have concerns with.
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day is the number one thing that people question and wonder why he didn't have to not testify, but have to explain some of the circumstances. And I know reading the discourse online, that was just huge as far as what people felt about the case. And, again, you are doing TV spots, you're doing all these things. You see how much the public had invested in this case. And I think there's a lot of people in the public, and I'm just talking like the general public, that really have no connection to the case other than, through the television and through what they've read, but they feel for the families. And I mean, that's what I feel for it. And the fact that they don't get to know what motivated this guy to target these kids that were just about to start their lives. And I don't blame their parents for having mixed feelings about all of this. Yeah. And hopefully one day he has no obligation. The problem is he has no obligation to speak ever anymore. I mean, and that's sort of where, I mean, yes,
he has no opportunity. I mean, he has the right not to say anything about this case. And, there's also laws that prevent him from talking about this case in some way and being compensated for it or making any money on it. So those kind of things. So there's no real incentive for him to talk about it. But then again, this is a guy, who's working on his doctor's degree in criminology, probably thinks he's pretty clever, probably thought, he was going to pull off the perfect crime. And, now, he may want to talk about it because, he may have liked the notoriety, the infamy that he received in this case. But as I understand it, these are just from news reports, of course, that things aren't going well in prison for him.
Shocking.
Yeah, there's a lot of guys who aren't looking favorably. Now, these are criminals themselves, but they're not necessarily guys who would go in and murder 4 college students in their apartment in the middle of the night. So they don't look favorably upon what he did. I thought it was interesting at the sentencing. Judge Hipple, I thought, did a very good job of making the sentencing about Ethan and Madison and Kaylee and Xana. That's what he focused on, and he didn't make this about Brian Koberger necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
He made it about these victims, their tragic and brutal murder, and their families who were left behind. But one of the things that I really kind of latched on to that I thought was pretty good. For one thing, Judge Hipple said that there was nothing redeeming about Kohlberger, and he said this, and I remember writing it down at the time, and he said that he will now be consigned to ignominy and isolation of perpetual incarceration. And I really like that, because that really takes a jab at a guy who's kind of living high on his infamy right now for all the attention that he got. And I thought that was pretty clever and appropriate in terms of his discussion while imposing sentence.
Yeah, I definitely feel like the way that the prosecution had put together a case, I mean, I think the general public can put together a pretty good blueprint of where, some of these motivations may have come from. I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get the full details unless he obviously explains it. But if you look at where, like you mentioned, he was going to school for criminology, and he thought he was super smart, and you've seen it with BTK where he likes to talk, and the Green River Killer you mentioned earlier as well. Yes, he did that service for them as far as showing them the bodies, but if you look back at some of the writings about it, he also kind of got off on that situation where he was able to relive the experience. So I don't know. It almost, like, the more that we talk this out, I'm kind of like, it almost took away that infamy part where he didn't get his moment in the sun. And I know it was, part of the plea, but he didn't get to stand up there and explain, and it's different than what BTK had to do, where he had to get up and detail by detail explain what he did, but that also gives BTK those things that he wanted. He stopped doing what he was doing for years and then came back because he wanted the infamy. And so the way that I'm feeling at the moment is the judge may have seen the aspect of that personality that Brian had and was like, no, I'm not going to let you talk. I'm not going to let you have the day that you want to have.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I thought that the judge did an effective job of diverting attention away from Kohlberger and focusing more on the victims and the victim's family, but also, making him realize that, hey, yeah, maybe you've enjoyed this run that you've had, but, you're off to a life of isolation in incarceration, and there's no glory in that. And there is, that this interest in Brian Koberger is going to disappear and be forgotten. And the point is that those 4 young college students will not be forgotten. They'll not be forgotten by their families and their friends and the university that they were attending. But Koberger is going to be, relegated to ignominy, and I thought that was pretty good.
Yeah, and I think it's, I hate talking about the perpetrator to this degree, but it's the subject of this episode. And so we are dedicating this episode to the talk about the end result of the case. But yeah, I don't want anybody to think that we're trying to glorify or anything or forget the victims, because those are the people and the victims' families and friends that really, at the end of the day, this doesn't change much for them. So it's hard to talk about him and not mention all the people that were killed. And I hope that the city and the college, they will do something, memorialize them in a good way. And you just see the bright smiles that they had in those pictures, and you're just like, damn, that was all of us in college, and it could have been any of us that fell victim to some psycho that just decided to, well, he didn't just decide, but, had been working his way towards committing some sort of brutal act, and he did that. And I wonder if, again, we don't have the answers. So, like, you are left to speculate. Did he know that all 4 people were in that house? Or was he trying to sexually assault somebody? And, like, all these things you're just left to wonder, which is okay, I guess. But because at the end of the day, like you said, it's just as good as the death penalty. The guy's not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. And I do think he'll probably eventually talk at some point, because, yeah, he wants some of this attention. And like you mentioned, he's not the Unabomber. He's not Ted Bundy. He's not going to be talked about in 5 years. Like, he's a pop killer. Like, he was just in the moment, and he basically rode this, and then there's he rode this wave of whatever. People supported him kind of in the same way people supported Bundy or the Menendez brothers. And I'm just kind of glad that it's all over at the end of the day, that it's just, we've been talking about this for years. And like you mentioned, they wanted a speedy trial and this, that, and the other, and blah, 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 blah. And next thing you know, it's a plea deal with nothing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look back, I mean, when the judge asked Koberger if he had anything to say, and I think at that point he said, "No, I respectfully, I don't." Somebody yelled, from the courtroom, "Coward," because they were still waiting. So he's pled guilty. He's being sentenced. He's going to be sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences. The judge says, "Is there anything you want to say?" And he said, respectfully, no, or something to that effect. And someone, blurts out, "Coward." So that there were people sitting in that court who were waiting to hear something from Brian Koberger, and they didn't get that.
They weren't satisfied.
No, and it's not as though the judge can say to him, "No, you tell me something. I want to hear something. I want to hear what." You can't do that. And I'm not suggesting that the judge could, but if the prosecution was inclined to, they could have made that statement part of their plea agreement.
Mm-hmm.
You want life, then you're going to tell us what happened. And if you don't want to tell us why it happened or how it happened or how you built up to this, then we're not going to give you a plea. We'll go to trial. Then I think, so we have to make sure certainly that your listeners understand that it wasn't up to the judge to say, "Hey, listen, Koberger, you tell us, or I'm not going to sentence you." No, the defendant has a right to say something if he wants to. That's what his rights are. And he can refuse to talk. But if talking is contingent on you getting life as opposed to facing the death penalty, yeah, you have to do it. And if you don't do it, at that point, the prosecutor says, well, the deal was he was going to talk. He's now saying respectfully, I don't want to talk. Well, the plea's withdrawn, schedule the case for trial.
So that's where, we've kind of gone full circle back to where, we see the plea deal and we don't get the details. So my question, and I think this is the question everybody has, is why didn't the prosecutors make that part of the plea deal?
Mm-hmm. And so I think, some of the explanation at a press conference, which is legitimate, is that, hey, listen, there's nothing that we believe Koberger will say truthfully. We think that having him, say why he did what he did is really not going to be reliable. It's really not going to add anything to this. It's not going to do anything for families because we can't trust him to even tell us the truth as to what he was thinking or what his motivations were. And we're not going to give him that stage to stand up there, one time before he goes off and talk to us in some condescending sense of why he did what he did. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, but some people do, and they've expressed their concern with that.
Even a written one would have been satisfying.
Right, a written statement. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things.
It still takes away the spotlight, and yeah, and then you mentioned before about him having trouble adapting to his new life in prison. Well, welcome to the new world, bud. And yeah, he's gonna have a heck of a time. People don't like people who kill young girls, and it's not.
Well, we know again based on some of the victim impact statements that that's what some of the victims' families were hoping for, and maybe worse than what's happening to him right now. But
you can't be referring to prison justice, could you?
Yeah, and I think some made that connection in very explicit manners. But
yes, they did, and I, that's the one good thing that I always appreciate, that the victims' families at least get to speak and share and get off whatever the hell they need to get off their chest, because who knows what they've been carrying around for all these years. And she had the young one had a couple nice jabs. In your experience, is it normal for the perpetrator not to say anything?
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Now sometimes, when it comes to a a plea agreement. A defendant is acknowledging that they committed the crime, and more often than not, if there's a plea, which a significant 90% or more of cases end up in pleas, defendants will maybe express some remorse or apologize for what they did. Oftentimes, in cases in which someone's convicted at trial, then you have potential appeal rights, or not potential, but you have appeal rights, and you have potential issues that you want to preserve on appeal. So you're not going to acknowledge your guilt or express remorse if you think you have a chance of filing an appeal and getting a new trial, and then that gets used against you at the next trial. So that's an issue that is important, but that's not always the case in when someone accepts a plea and is being sentenced, because they've already acknowledged their guilt, and they're not going to have appeal rights based on the fact that they pled guilty, other than some specific appeal rights on the legality of the sentence and things like that. So I find that most people don't say a lot at sentencing, and I have clients, and I ask, I say, hey, maybe just express, I've learned a lesson by this. I'm sorry that I caused this harm, and I'm gonna try to live my life in a different manner. And those are not always cases in which there's catastrophic issues and victims and things like that.
They have a possibility for a future outside of prison, and their statements will, help them at the end of the day when they go up for parole or whatever.
Right.
And yeah, I see what you're saying. And I of course, I didn't expect him to say anything when it was revealed that it wasn't required.
Right.
What's he going to do? Like, stand up there and be like, yes, I did it. And, like, that wouldn't be the time or place, and even really to do that. I think if the judge, like you mentioned before, knew that it was part of the deal and said, no, you got to do it. Yeah. Okay, fine. But I guess I see both sides of the family's perspective, because I know some of them left very unsatisfied, but some of them were like, okay.
Yeah, and the thing for him is, it wasn't a condition of the plea. Okay, so he had no responsibility there, and his expressing remorse or sympathy is going to have no impact on the sentence at all, because these are the mandatories that you can get. He's getting life without parole, one after the other, plus 10 years. Being remorseful, being sympathetic, even trying to be kind to the families is going to have no impact on you. So if you're not compelled to do it, there really is no reason for a defendant in his situation to express any of that or explain anything at all.
Yeah, the way you explain it just sounds like way more trouble than it's worth, because of how unappealing that would be, and how fake, the statement would be. So, yeah, I hear you. I got what you're saying. You've kind of helped me understand this beyond what the headlines were saying and what was the discourse on social. And I think it's really helpful to hear from you, obviously, that you're in the profession of law and been on both sides of the aisle. So it's super helpful for me to pick your brain on this stuff. And I guess at the end of the day, it's all over. He's going to be in Idaho Max, whatever, their Super Max, whatever their prison is. And he's never getting out. So the days of his fame, or whatever you want to call it, because it's not really fame, but infamy, are certainly numbered. And if the families get what they want, then everything else is numbered too. So,
and the thing that I think is important too is, even as Judge Hipple said at the time, this idea of isolation, of perpetual incarceration. So take somebody like Charles Manson. Charles Manson, was, when he was originally convicted, he was convicted and sentenced to death. He was responsible for 10 murders, the high profile Sharon Tate and all that. And then, the death penalty had been ruled unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court in 1972. So his sentence was commuted to life in prison. Mm-hmm. But in California, life in prison didn't mean life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was more like 25 years to life. And so what always brought Charles Manson back into the public eye was he would have parole hearings.
Right.
And those parole hearings would generate all kind of interest, and people would start reading about Charles Manson again and start talking about Charles Manson. That's not going to happen with Bryan Koberger. He's never going to come before any kind of tribunal that's going to make any kind of decision about him. No one's going to talk about Bryan Koberger in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. It's just not going to happen. This case might be, and as I said, it's going to burn in the hearts of these families and the university community, and that community, Moscow and Idaho. But Bryan Koberger is going to be long forgotten.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. And with Manson, it's a great example, because he had family members that also would go up for parole hearings. And so that would also stir the pot. And yeah, right. Koberger, he is yesterday's news, other than to the families and the people that were the closest to the victims. Right. So his days are done. The case, we can put a bow on it and forget about it, because there's nothing worth thinking about other than the families and remembering the lives of the victims. And I do appreciate you coming on, because I know you're a busy TV man and a lawyer and all that other super cool stuff. And you just help explain it in a better way than what is conveyed via anything on the online or on the news. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I always am excited to come on your show and to talk with you, Bill. I think you got a great thing going, and I think it's a service to your listeners and to the community. So thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Well, Matt, you're welcome anytime. And quick question, are you going to be at CrimeCon this year?
No, actually, I'm not going to be at CrimeCon. I see that you are.
Yes, I am. Well, I also live in Denver, so that's convenient.
That makes it easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I was just looking at the rundown of all the people who are going to be there, and I saw you're back on the list, which is great. And so I was there. I went to CrimeCon in 2022 and 2024. Maybe they'll ask me back in 2026.
You're never
what a good word for me.
Yeah, it was like when I played Little League and we won the World Series every other year, but we were the worst team the other year. So
yeah,
hey, I kind of been on a up and down cycle and with the CrimeCon, but yeah, it should be interesting. But yeah, being so close and down the street, I'm happy about that. And again, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, great. Good to talk to you, Bill.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into this week's episode of Who Killed. Again, I'm your host, Bill Huffman, and this is an Evergreen and Slow Burn Media production. I will be at CrimeCon this weekend, and you can come by my booth. It is at table 31 on Creators Row. So come check me out. I'll be there with some freebies and magnets and whatnot. So thanks again for Matt Mangino for coming on this week to talk about the end result in the Idaho 4 case, and we can put that case to rest. So see you guys at CrimeCon. Until next time, be healthy and stay safe.